that there is only one science where you can actually prove something that is unequivocally correct, and that is mathematics. You can actually prove something beyond any doubt whatsoever that something is correct or incorrect, and that stands the test of time. All other science, every science, is based on a theory. And that theory we take as fact until one of its predictions falls down. So some of the theories I'm going to talk about here have actually lasted over 1,000 years until they realized, no, this wasn't quite right. So anyway, let's get into it. I have been introduced before, so I'm not going to go through this, just point out the last bullet. That is the subject of tomorrow's talk, when we will address dog communication, how they talk to each other, how they try and tell us what is going on, and so I will teach you how to better understand what your dog is trying to say. Alright, I've broken this down into various categories. I thought we'd start with medicine and biology, and yes, most of the slide is there this time. Good. Originally, health was thought to depend on 4 humours. They're shown in this diagram down here, and the symptoms are surrounding that little box. So yellow bile is associated with fire, which is one of the elements of the ancients. Hot and dry is associated with that. Over on your right there is blood, that is associated with air, one of the fundamental elements. At the bottom, phlegm is associated with water. Remember, water was a fundamental element. We'll see an effect of that a little bit later in one of the other theories. So if these 4 humours got out of balance, you would become sick. And treatment then was based on trying to re-establish the balance of those humours in the body. So bloodletting, because you had an excess of blood, purges, because you had an excess, or emetics to get rid of various materials. They would also use herbs in a sort of medicinal way. We'll see an example of that in a minute. So here's some treatments. If you had a fever, that's hot and dry, and that was yellow bile. There was an imbalance of yellow bile amongst the 4 humours. So you wanted to increase the opposite, which was phlegm, and that meant cold baths. Well, they actually got that one kind of right, didn't they? Because you're trying to bring the fever down, and that is one way of bringing fevers down. This carried on. You see here John Baptist van Helmont in the early 1600s. He actually tried to examine this in a scientific way. He grew a willow tree for 5 years and showed how the willow tree increased in mass, while apparently the soil really didn't change very much at all. It's not understanding anything about gaseous exchange and so on. He had a recipe for mice. You see it there, basically a piece of soiled cloth with wheat left out for 21 days. And mice would spontaneously generate around this. Well, I think this is perhaps an example of mice finding the food and hanging around the food. But he also had a recipe for scorpions. You see there basil placed between 2 bricks and left out in the sunlight. And presumably the sunlight provided the energy on the basil, and the brick somehow cooked it into a scorpion. Really don't know how he came up with that one. So now let's change into a broader subject, which is astronomy and cosmology. The world ice theory is one of the wackiest ones I've come across. Hans Horbiger received a vision in 1894, at least so he claims, and in this vision he was told that ice is the substance of all basic substances. So everything is made of ice, somehow. This podium is made of ice, my laptop is made of ice, the chairs you're sitting on are made of ice, and so are we, somehow. You see there he had postulated it created the ice moons, the ice planets, a global ether, and the entire universe. And this is Hans Horbiger, if you hadn't noticed, realized. He stated that he knew Newton had been wrong and that the sun's gravitational pull ceases to exist at 3 times the distance of Neptune. Well, that's really hard to disprove, especially in his time. Now, he got a lot of support for this very wacky theory, and although I haven't said so on this slide, one of the reasons he was able to get his theory so well accepted by the general public is he actually had a very efficient PR machine. And it was this public relations campaign that surrounded his theories that got general acceptance. He also came out some other wacky rebuttals to people that criticized him. I do love the first one. Calculation can only lead you astray. Sometimes think the banks do that to us. Pictures of the Milky Way have been faked by reactionary astronomers, because those stars that are in the Milky Way don't really exist. You can see how wacky this was. It was adopted by the Nazi Party as their standard cosmology. Cold fusion, remember this one? 1989, Pons and Fleischmann published experimental results saying that they had fusion at room temperature. These were hailed as a major breakthrough in science, and it was briefly believed that we now had a cheap source of clean and abundant energy. And you see here, it was on the front of Time magazine. Unfortunately, nobody's ever been able to reproduce these results, and this seems to have died a death. Phlogiston. This is, I think, my all-time favorite of things that weren't correct. It was first put forward in 1667 by a German physicist, and he suggested that in addition to air, water, fire, and earth, there was a fifth element. This fifth element was phlogiston, and it described, or it was absolutely essential to account for what happened in the process of burning. So here is an example of the process that he came up with. This is wood. It's got lots of phlogiston in it, plus the other elements, the four elements. And in the burning process, the phlogiston is released to the air, and what remains is dephlogistonated substance, just consisting of a mixture of earth, water, air, and fire. So phlogiston lasted 116 years. And what also came out of this experiment is he proved that water was a compound, not an element, because you obtain water when you burn hydrogen and oxygen. And remember, water was one of the four fundamental elements of the ancients. So not only did he get rid of phlogiston, but he also swept aside the fact that there were four basic elements: earth, fire, air, and water. That brings me to the end of scientific theories of the world.